There's a house in central Virginia that has not run its air conditioner once in 11 summers. Not because the family living there tolerates the heat, not because they installed expensive solar panels or some exotic cooling technology that required an engineer and a permit and a check written to a specialist. Because 14 years ago, the man who built that house dug a trench across his backyard with a rented machine, dropped a plastic pipe into it, covered it back up, and connected the other end to his return duct. The whole project took a Saturday and cost him less than a used window unit. And every summer since then, when his neighbors are running central air around the clock and watching their July electricity bills climb past $300, his house sits at 62 degrees without a single compressor cycling. His children grew up thinking that was normal. They thought every house worked this way. They were right that it should. They were wrong that it does. And the gap between those two things, between what should be standard and what got erased from the building industry over 7 decades, is one of the most consequential stories in the history of American residential construction that almost nobody has ever told. The physics behind what is happening under that Virginia yard is not complicated, but it has 2 layers, and almost every explanation you will find stops at the first layer and misses the second one entirely, which is the more interesting of the 2. The first layer is thermal mass. 4 feet below the surface of any yard in the continental United States, the soil maintains a temperature that is nearly constant year-round, typically between 53 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on latitude, hovering around what the average annual surface temperature of that region has been over many decades. This is not a rough estimate. It is a measurement that has been confirmed at monitoring stations across North America, Europe, and Asia for more than half a century. The surface of the Earth in July in Phoenix can reach 140 degrees. 4 feet down, it is 57. The same ground in January, when the surface is frozen to iron hardness, is still sitting at 57 4 feet below. The extremes happening above do not reach it. They cannot. The soil is too deep, and the thermal wave too slow for surface conditions to propagate meaningfully to that depth before the season has already reversed itself above. That is the first layer. Dense material holds temperature and insulates against change. You have known this your whole life in the form of caves, root cellars, wine cellars, any space that goes underground and stays cool regardless of what the summer above is doing. The second layer is where it gets genuinely strange. And it is the layer that the cooling industry absolutely does not want you to think about carefully. Because once you do, the compressor starts to look less like a necessity and more like an expensive substitute for a hole in the ground. Soil is not just a thermal battery. It is a low-pass filter for temperature waves. The surface of the Earth heats and cools in a wave driven by the seasons, a cycle that repeats every 12 months with the sun delivering energy in summer and withdrawing it in winter. That wave does not stop at the surface. It propagates downward into the ground, but as it travels deeper, it weakens and it slows. The rate at which it slows is described by a property called thermal diffusivity. And for typical moist soil, the value of that property is small enough that a temperature wave takes approximately 6 months to travel from the surface to a depth of 4 feet. 6 months. Which means the soil temperature at the depth of your buried pipe on any given summer day is not responding to the weather happening above it right now. It is responding to the weather that happened 6 months ago. The cool temperature your pipe is exchanging heat with on a 90-degree July afternoon is not some abstract average. It is last January's cold stored in the ground, delayed by exactly half a year, arriving underground precisely when you need it. Your backyard is not a freezer. It is a time machine. The winter puts cold into the ground in February, and the ground delivers it back to your house in August. The summer puts heat into the ground in July, and the ground holds it there until January, when the surface has already turned cold again. The cycle is self-renewing. The resource never depletes. And the pipe you buried 4 feet down is simply the interface between your house and a thermal storage system the size of your entire property that has been running continuously for longer than anyone has been alive to measure it. Now connect that physics to a pipe. A smooth-bore plastic pipe, the kind available at any hardware store, buried in a trench 4 feet deep, running from an intake point somewhere in your yard to an entry point in your home's cold air return duct, or to a dedicated ventilation register in a room you want cooled. Hot outside air enters the intake end of that pipe. It travels through the pipe at whatever rate your inline fan or your home's existing blower is pulling it. As it travels, it is surrounded on all sides by soil sitting at 55 to 60 degrees. Heat moves from the air in the pipe, which is hotter, into the soil surrounding the pipe, which is cooler because that is what heat always does. It moves from where there is more of it to where there is less. By the time that air reaches the interior end of the pipe, it has given up a significant portion of the heat it carried when it entered. Measurements taken on real systems and real climates show drops of 15 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit between the intake temperature and the outlet temperature, depending on pipe length, burial depth, soil moisture content, and airflow rate. 30 degrees, with no compressor, with no refrigerant, with no chemistry happening anywhere in the system, just air moving slowly through a temperature gradient that the Earth provides for free. The Ontario research that documented this most rigorously ran 9 separate Earth tubes at a conservation monitoring site, each tube 20 meters long, buried 2 meters deep, operating continuously through 8 full summers. Outside, air entered on a 90-degree afternoon and exited the pipe at 59 degrees. That is a 31-degree drop across 200 feet of buried plastic pipe in real Canadian summer conditions, not in a laboratory, not under controlled conditions, but operating in actual climate with actual variation in humidity and temperature and cloud cover. The system never underperformed relative to its design parameters. It never degraded. It did not become less efficient as the seasons passed. The research notes something that deserves to be read twice because it runs exactly counter to the experience of every mechanical cooling system you have ever owned. The system's efficiency did not decline over time. It improved slightly over the first 3 years as the soil around the pipe thermally adjusted to the presence of the tube and developed a slightly more stable temperature profile in the surrounding zone. After 3 years, it plateaued at peak performance and held there for the duration of the study. Every air conditioner you have ever owned began losing efficiency on the day it was installed and continued declining until it died. The buried pipe got better. That inversion of the typical product life cycle is precisely why no manufacturer has ever had any financial interest in telling you this technology exists. The history of the system is longer than most people would guess, and the timeline of its suppression is more deliberate than most people would be comfortable believing if it were not so thoroughly documented. In 1897, a German architect named Heinrich Scheler published a technical paper describing what he called the Erdkanal, the Earth Channel, after studying underground air tempering tunnels built into the stone foundations of farmhouses in the Rhine Valley. Some of those tunnels, he documented, had been in continuous operation since the early 1700s. The farmers who built them did not have the vocabulary of thermal diffusivity or volumetric heat capacity. They had something more immediately useful. They had observation. They noticed that air pulled through a long underground passage arrived cooler than the air outside, regardless of the season. They built accordingly. They told their children told their children. And the knowledge propagated forward not through publications or building codes, but through community, through the lived experience of houses that stayed comfortable without any machinery running. German-speaking settlers carried this knowledge to Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. Those settlers became, in part, the communities we now call the Pennsylvania Dutch and the Amish, and in Lancaster County, Ohio, and Holmes County today, there are farmhouses still standing with the remnants of their original clay pipe earth air systems visible in the stone foundations. The clay has crumbled in some of them. The intake openings are sometimes sealed over or overgrown, but the pipe routes are still there in the walls, installed by people who understood instinctively what modern building science has spent decades rediscovering with instruments. Walk into one of those Amish farmhouses on a 95-degree August afternoon and feel what the air is doing. Still cool. Quiet in a way that has nothing to do with machinery, because there is no machinery. Just a house connected to the ground beneath it, in a way that most of modern construction has completely severed. The United States federal government formally documented how to build one of these systems in 1947. United States Department of Agriculture Farmers Bulletin number 1918, titled Ventilation of Farm Buildings, contains a complete technical section on underground air inlets. It specifies the burial depth. It specifies the pipe diameter range appropriate for different building sizes. It specifies the intake placement, the slope requirement for drainage, the minimum length for effective heat exchange, and the connection method to the interior ventilation system of the building. Plain language, imperial and metric dimensions, published by the federal government, printed with taxpayer money, distributed through agricultural extension offices across all 48 states, available for 15 cents. Every farmer in America who wanted one had the blueprint. And then, systematically, over the following 2 decades, it vanished from every major building guide, every contractor manual, every residential construction standard written after 1960. The timeline of that disappearance is not accidental, and the mechanism behind it is not difficult to trace. Natural gas pipeline infrastructure expanded massively through the American Midwest and South between 1950 and 1970. The pipelines reached rural towns that had previously relied on wood and coal and passive thermal systems to stay warm in winter and cool in summer. Gas furnaces became the default heating option written into new construction standards. Forced air central cooling followed in the 1960s as electric utilities recognized the summer load opportunity and worked with equipment manufacturers to establish air conditioning as the expected feature of a modern home. Each of those technologies had an industry behind it, a manufacturing base, a network of installers, a financing ecosystem, a lobbying presence in the offices where building codes were written. The underground earth tube had none of those things. It had no manufacturer because you could not patent a hole in the ground. It had no installer industry because any competent person with a rented trencher could build one in a weekend. It had no maintenance revenue stream because there was almost nothing to maintain. And so it had no advocate in the rooms where standards were written. It did not get banned. It did not get disproven. It simply fell out of the manuals, and the generation of builders who trained after 1965 never encountered it, and the generation after them never heard of it, and by now it has been absent from mainstream construction practice long enough that most licensed contractors genuinely do not know it exists. What happened after 2020 was less passive and more deliberate. Internal documents from the American Gas Association, made public through investigative reporting, showed that passive thermal alternatives, including earth-coupled systems, were specifically named as existential threats to residential natural gas consumption. The documented response was not to compete on merit. It was legislative. Since 2020, gas industry-aligned trade groups have pushed preemption bills through more than 25 state legislatures. Those bills restrict the ability of local governments to encourage, incentivize, or write passive thermal systems into local building code as recognized alternatives to mechanical heating and cooling. When the text of those bills was analyzed by researchers, the language was nearly identical across states that introduced them within weeks of each other. Utah, Texas, Arizona, Louisiana, drafted not by the legislators who introduced them, but by the industry groups who delivered the text pre-written and ready for submission. One Utah state representative, when pressed in a recorded interview on where the bill originated, acknowledged that he had become aware of it through his local gas supplier and had introduced it essentially as delivered. The same structural approach operates in the cooling equipment space. The trade association representing major residential air conditioning manufacturers has for decades opposed any building code category that would formally recognize a passive earth-coupled pipe as an alternative to mechanical cooling. Without a recognized category, there is no approval pathway. Without an approval pathway, no licensed contractor will install one for liability reasons. Without contractor installation, the technology never appears in the options a homeowner is offered when they sit down with a builder or a renovation contractor. That is how you erase a free technology without ever banning it. You do not need to suppress the physics. You only need to suppress the pathway between the physics and the homeowner's backyard. The combined American heating and cooling equipment industry generates revenues that exceed $200 billion annually when you account for equipment sales, replacement cycles, refrigerant supply chains, installation labor, service contracts, repair calls, and the electricity utility revenue tied to running these systems year-round. A buried plastic pipe that costs $250 in parts and 1 weekend of labor threatens every line item on that list simultaneously. It replaces the equipment. It eliminates the repair and replacement cycle. It has no refrigerant to recharge. It draws so little electricity that the effect on a utility bill is negligible. It does not require a contractor for installation. It does not require a permit in most jurisdictions because it is categorized as passive ventilation rather than cooling equipment, a classification the preemption bills apparently never thought to close. And it lasts, in documented cases, for decades, without any meaningful degradation. The compressor that cost $4,000 to install is being replaced right now in houses across America on average every 12 to 15 years. The clay pipe in that Pennsylvania farmhouse foundation has been moving air since 1730, and the intake opening is still there in the stone wall. The single objection that gets raised against earth tube systems in every building science paper and every contractor conversation where the topic somehow manages to come up is condensation and mold. The argument is straightforward. Warm, humid outside air enters a cool pipe. The air cools as it travels. Cooled air holds less moisture than warm air. That moisture condenses on the interior surface of the pipe. In a poorly designed system with low points where water can collect, that standing moisture becomes a biological environment. Mold grows. The system that was meant to bring clean, cool air into your house begins circulating something considerably less pleasant. This objection is raised with such frequency and such confidence by cooling industry consultants that it has successfully deterred a generation of homeowners who otherwise would have built one. And the objection, applied to a poorly designed system, is entirely correct. Condensation is real. The biology that follows standing water in a dark pipe is real. Both of these things can ruin a system, and both of them have ruined systems built by people who did not understand why slope matters. The solution is not complicated, and it is not new. The Amish figured it out empirically before any university measured it with instruments. The pipe must slope continuously and without interruption from the interior end of the system down toward the outdoor intake. Not steeply. 1 inch of drop for every 10 feet of pipe length. Less than 1% grade. That is enough. Any condensate that forms on the interior wall of the pipe flows with that grade toward the intake end rather than pooling at a low point. At the intake end, the pipe terminates over a drainage bed or a simple trap and cleanout fitting that allows accumulated condensate to exit the system before it can collect. Without standing water, there is no persistent wet environment. Without a persistent wet environment, there is no biological habitat for mold to establish. The European Passive House Institute documented this across a 5-year continuous operation study of properly drained earth tube systems in multiple Central European climates, pulling air samples from pipe outlets at the end of year 5 and finding microbiological activity statistically indistinguishable from the outdoor ambient air entering the system. The pipes were clean. The science is not ambiguous. The mold objection is a design problem with a design solution, not a fundamental flaw in the technology. The industry presents it as the latter because it is much more effective as a deterrent that way. The materials list for building one is almost offensive in its simplicity when you set it next to the invoice for a central air conditioning installation. 40 feet of 8-inch smooth-bore PVC pipe, the same pipe used for drainage applications at any hardware store, costs between $60 and $90. A screened intake cap to keep animals and debris out of the outdoor end costs $12. A small inline duct fan to maintain continuous slow airflow through the system uses approximately as much electricity as a single incandescent bulb and costs $40. A drain fitting for the low end of the intake costs $8. Pipe cement, couplings, and a length of insulated flex duct to connect the interior end to your cold air return add, another $30. Total materials cost for a complete functional system is under $200 at current prices, often less if you are resourceful about where you source the pipe. The labor is a half day with a rented walk-behind trencher, available at any equipment rental yard for around $120 for a 4-hour window. The trencher cuts a 40-foot trench 4 feet deep through average suburban soil in approximately 90 minutes. You drop the pipe in, check your slope with a level, connect the intake cap at the outdoor end, connect the interior end to your existing return duct with duct mastic at the joint. Backfill the trench and plant grass seed over the disturbed soil. $350. One weekend. No permit required in most states. No contractor needed. No ongoing cost beyond the electricity cost of a fan that runs at roughly the same draw as a nightlight. If your home uses central forced air, the connection to the existing system is the simplest part of the entire project. Your home's existing air handler is already pulling air through a return duct system and pushing it through supply registers into living spaces. You cut an opening in the return duct in a convenient location, flange the earth tube pipe end into that opening, seal the connection with duct mastic, and the existing blower does the rest. Every time the system calls for cooling, it draws a mixture of recirculated indoor air and earth-tempered outdoor air through the system. The outdoor air has already dropped 15 to 30 degrees by the time it reaches that return duct. The compressor, if it runs at all, is closing a much smaller gap than it would be closing against unmodified outdoor air. Many homeowners who have done this report that the compressor stages on significantly less frequently during moderate weather and that their electricity consumption in the months of May, June, September, and October drops dramatically, those being the months when the gap between outdoor temperature and comfortable indoor temperature is modest enough that earth-tempered air can close it without mechanical assistance at all. In the peak summer months in genuinely hot climates, the earth tube does not eliminate the need for a compressor on the hottest days. It reduces how hard and how long that compressor has to run. A compressor, working to close a 10-degree gap rather than a 40-degree gap, consumes a fraction of the electricity, runs for a fraction of the time, produces a fraction of the wear, and lasts correspondingly longer before it needs replacement. The economics compound in both directions. Less electricity consumed each month, fewer repair calls over the life of the system. A compressor replacement cycle that extends from 12 years to perhaps 18 because the equipment is simply not being worked as hard. And underneath all of it, a pipe that is getting slightly more efficient every year for the first 3 years and then holding that peak efficiency for the entire remaining life of the house. The man in Virginia whose children grew up thinking that cool, quiet houses without humming compressors were normal is not an engineer. He is not a contractor. He did not have specialized knowledge that is unavailable to anyone reading these words. He had a rented trencher, a hardware store, 2 days, and a willingness to understand the physics before dismissing it. The physics has not changed since 1947 when the federal government published the blueprint. It has not changed since 1897 when a German architect measured it in Rhine Valley farmhouses. It has not changed since the early 1700s when Pennsylvania settlers packed it into the stone foundations of houses that are still standing. The ground beneath your yard is sitting at 55 degrees right now. It was sitting at 55 degrees last July when you were running your air conditioner every afternoon. It will be sitting at 55 degrees next July. The thermal resource is there. The blueprint is public. The materials are at the hardware store. The trench takes an afternoon to dig. The only thing that has ever stood between that resource and your house is the systematic removal of the knowledge that it exists from every channel through which a homeowner might have encountered it, and the coordinated legislative effort to ensure that even if you find out about it, The official pathway to using it is as obstructed as the people who profit from your compressor can make it. The pipe does not care about any of that. The ground does not care. The physics that moved February cold into a Virginia kitchen in August has been operating without interruption for longer than the heating and cooling industry has existed, and it will keep operating long after the last compressor sold this year has been hauled to the scrapyard. The trench is patient, the temperature is constant, and the blueprint, all these years later, is still sitting in the National Agricultural Library Archive under document number 1918, exactly where the government left it before the industry decided you should not know it was there.